Welcome back to this read-along book club of Stephen R. Donaldson's The Real Story. Things are coming full circle with this group of chapters because we are getting, we're kind of back to the beginning. It's very reminiscent of the first few chapters, the first quarter of this book, I guess, when the crowd of Mallorys were giving us their group impression of what Angus and Nick and Morn were doing at Mallory's. The difference here, though, is that it's less of that kind of third-person plural POV. We're still kind of omniscient, though, I feel like. And this book veers into very different POVs, depending on what chapter it is. I can only assume it's purposeful. I feel like Donaldson is trying to bookend it, right? Because we had a certain narrative voice at the beginning. It seems to be kind of like that, although in a more singular way, however, not so limited. But let us move on to chapter 10 and talk about it. But let me know, what are you thinking? Are you still digging this book? I actually bought the entire series today because I plan to continue this. I probably won't read it and make videos in this fashion, but I'll probably put some reviews out there as I power through this series, because it's funny. I love science fiction, but I don't really like military science fiction. And from what I've read in reviews, and hopefully they're correct because I bought the entire series, is that we don't delve into that territory. It's just not interesting, and I feel like, to me, there's so much science fiction out there that just goes on and on about the military aspect of space battles. And anyway, this is for another conversation. Let's talk about chapter 10. He did his best to believe it was happening. In an odd way, as long as he kept her alive, survival depended on her. He could be truly safe only if he killed her and disposed of her body. He had to break her and be sure of it, damage her so much that he could trust the results. By degrees, he beat her down until she was like a child toward him, dependent, urgent, to please. So Donaldson is continually reinforcing the theme of control, the theme of Angus's insecurities, you might say. It feels a little bit repetitive, but it's not completely bothering me so far. There's some distance I put myself at with this novel because I love it. It's very reminiscent of, old sci-fi, obviously, with the exception of the violence toward females. Like I didn't watch movies like that as a kid, clearly, but just the feeling of it. Anyway, let's move on. He assured her that she deserved what was happening to her. She'd killed her family, hadn't she? She betrayed them all. No, it wasn't something she'd done by conscious choice. It was worse. It was something she'd done because of who she was, because of the fundamental flaw, which left her vulnerable to gap sickness. So that's an interesting concept, because I remember Angus talking about how a lot of these cops, these space cops, they're recruited because they have they're tested. Similarly how when you want to become an astronaut, you got to go through these crazy physical tests and just be spun around in things, because of zero gravity. And but she has this weakness, and so I don't want to say willingly, maybe I missed something in the book, remind me if I did, but she decided to become what she hated, right? What her parents were, and that led her to succumb to gap sickness, which led her to kill her entire family. So interesting. I really like what he's doing with the characters here, because every one of them, Nick, Angus, Morn, they all have their motivations. They're initiated from trauma. So even though Angus is a very terrible man, right, doing terrible things, I can at least understand where he's coming from, because remember, he got cornholed by an entire police academy pretty much. But alas, even his grubby, suspicious nature believed that she'd been damaged enough to risk. Then, with a UMC cop for crew, he took his ship out of hiding finally. So we are headed back. And 6 days later, Bright Beauty sputtered into Calm Mind Station's control space and requested permission to dock. The inspector assigned clear Angus Thermopylae, and Bright Beauty wasn't particularly interested in his job that day, though, and now returned with a woman as crew. He didn't ask Angus to explain this detail. He got Morn's name and fed it into the station's ID computer. After that, the situation got messy. Bright Beauty was slapped in quarantine, and the whole parade of inspectors trooped through her, asking questions, issuing directives, making demands. What happened to Star Master? How did you survive? How did you end up with him? Of course, because he is the Frogman. And Morn refused to answer their questions, though. She was a cop, and she refused. Periodically, an inspector tried to appropriate Bright Beauty's data core. Angus positively declined to release it until he was formally charged with a crime. That is the only time he was going to do it. But what happened to Star Master? Blew up, he answered for no reason. Must have been sabotage. How did you survive? Freak accident. I love this exchange because if I were to write this myself, I'd probably do it in dialogue. But I like this. I've seen this, I think, one other instance, I believe, in a novel where rather than just going bit by bit, dialogue by dialogue, it's assumed it's dialogue. It feels like dialogue, but it's a way to just kind of brush through this stuff. And I think he's doing that because, again, we've somewhat experienced this already. But how did you survive? Freak accident. Angus could see the terrible hurt behind her eyes, but he relied on the zone implant to keep her quiet. Why are you with him? He's a known pirate. I don't care what you believe, Angus said with relish. I told you Star Master blew up. The only question they really wanted Angus to answer was, what happened to your ship? You look like you've been in a dogfight. I got hit by a rock, he says. Star Master was after you. You crashed trying to run. Isn't that the truth? No. Then how did you happen to be the one who came to the rescue? Coincidence. I was close enough. The blast made my scan go crazy. Radio interference, particle noise. So I tracked it back and found her. Your air scrubbers should have failed a long time ago. How come you're still breathing? Rescuer's privilege. I took filters from the ship. His bluff was working. Why is she staying with you? She's going to hire somebody to carry a message back to Earth. When UMCP HQ sends out instructions, she'll know what to do. Until then, she trusts me more than you. Bam. Angus is dialing it in. In the end, the inspectors had no choice, of course. They didn't believe the story. But Angus Thermopylae took Morn Highland directly to Delsec. His bluff had worked. He had no actual desire to go to Mallory's. He wanted to seal his hatches and fuck Morn until she wept. I will give Donaldson credit for going to these places and just bluntly stating those things. But it was still possible that his hold on her might snap, and he didn't want to risk her in public. It was conceivable that he could claim a salvage on Star Master. With enough money, he would get Bright Beauty rebuilt. Then he would be invulnerable. He could do anything he wanted. He could have freedom. But everybody on Commine was waiting for him to make a mistake to get caught. All the inspectors, everybody in security, every prospector or miner who had ever tried the belt, everybody in Mallory's who knew his reputation and didn't trust him. He caught sight of Nick Soccorso through the heat and did at Mallory. So now we're coming back to Nick finally. I wonder when this was going to happen. I'm glad it is happening finally because we're toward the end of the book. He would have recognized Nick as an enemy immediately in any case. He knew Nick's contempt for him was instantaneous. He saw Nick glance at him, dismiss him, and look at Morn. And he saw Morn's reaction. Ooh, and this really rubs Angus the wrong way. Her face betrayed nothing. She said nothing. But he knew her intimately, knew every pulse of her heartbeat, every hue of her skin, every shade of horror and hurt in the depths of her eyes. He knew immediately that Nick Soccorso had more power over her than he did. Wow, and this is the entire thing that he's been working toward. And this handsome man just wins her over just like that. But there's a little bit of a twist, right? Nick had the power to make her want him until this moment when he saw and understood the way Morn and Nick looked at each other. He hadn't realized how much power he lacked. No matter what he did, however, he could never make her want him. And that is the sad, tragic tale of this man. I'm not saying you have to feel bad for him because he's an absolute asshole, but he was kind of created in a way. And that doesn't mean that he had to turn into this kind of person despite his terrible life experiences. But I appreciate that. I think Donaldson's doing a great job with at least explaining the motivations of these people, hopefully creating empathy to a degree. But let us move on to chapter 11. The truth was that Morn Highland didn't see Nick Soccorso as a sexual being at all. This is what I was talking, sexual being at all. So this is what I was talking about, the little twist there. She hardly noticed Nick was male. If she had, she would have turned her back on him. Why? Because she didn't want a man. Any male touch would have made her ache and scream and pulse and puke because of Angus. Angus had more power over her than he realized. And so this is when we're swinging into Morn's psyche, kind of. It's weird because I don't feel like we're in limited third at all in this, but we're getting her perspective. So I guess this is just omniscient dipping into her head, at least looking into her head. Yet he was right when he sensed that something leapt up inside Morn at the sight of Nick Soccorso. That something, in quotes, however, had nothing whatever to do with Nick's handsomeness, his virility, his physical appeal. She wanted him, not as a man, but as an effective force. Angus had come too close to breaking her. Which is interesting to note because that was always a question in my mind. And let me know if you felt the same way. Morn didn't seem like... I think I mentioned this in the last video, but she seemed often like she was being robotic. Some of these responses she was making felt not realistic, not like she was being broken, but they were like she was trying to make Angus feel as if she were being broken. But apparently here, right? I mean, if this is truth, in fact, it feels like he got very close, but he taught her how to hate. This something which had leapt up in her at the sight of Nick Scorso was simply the hope that Angus could be beaten, right? This is it. She's looking at Nick as her savior, but not because he's this handsome, dashing lad. But as for Nick himself, like Angus, the other people in Mallory's were wrong about him as well. I love it's. This is so pulpy, man. I love this. It's like it's almost like a comic book, right? The whole just flipping back and forth between these da da da. But this happened. But this happened. But I think it really works. It's a cool technique. I don't think I've ever read this in fiction, in prose. Comic books all the time, which makes me wonder if Donaldson was inspired by comics at all. But the truth, which he kept to himself, was that he didn't actually like women. In secret, he feared and despised them. Why? Because we learn why. And so I'm not going to summarize it just yet. Let's get into it. He preferred seeing them hurt. Once when he was barely a man in years and no more than a boy in experience, he'd been bested by a woman. His scars were the marks of her contempt. Everyone else she had killed, but him she left with only his scars to remember her by. That ship had been the original captain's fancy, the inspiration of the name Nick now used for his pretty frigate, which is interesting because he aspired to, be a part of this crew and, be a successful spaceman. But it ended terribly for him, because he got the scars, he was taken advantage of, he was left, she killed everybody except him, he's humiliated, but still he clung to that. So interesting little character stuff. But Nick Scorso, which incidentally wasn't his real name, who knew, had been born station-bound. He was the son of a family of administrators living on a station like Combine. There he'd begun watching the scan at an early age. So this is when he's getting the stars in his eyes. Unlike most of his peers, however, he'd fallen in love with what he'd watched, with the vast gulf of space and the lure of the gap, with the romance of sailing the imponderable stellar winds. Specifically, he'd fallen in love with Captain's fancy, and young Nick Scorso ached to sign aboard the ship under any imaginable contract or conditions. "Good heavens, no," said his mother. "Are you out of your mind?" asked his father. But the command second, who meant well, had taken the time to finally say, "Forget it, kid." Only way you'll ever get on the ship is go to one of the academies, Earth, Alpha Green, Orion's Reach. "Are you out of your mind?" demanded his father. "What makes you think we've got that kind of money?" Because we find out it's very expensive. But he couldn't bear to see his dreams curdle. He began to plot crime. So he, like Angus, turns to crime. With the logic of the young, Nick reasoned that wherever there was piracy, there were pirates. And wherever there were pirates, there was a demand for information. Destinations, cargoes, arrival dates. Nick worked scan. He had access to that kind of information. He met the woman who scarred him next. The scars came later, of course. She knew what she was doing and did it well. First came casual conversation, casual drinks, casual sex. His first casual mention of Captain's fancy passed as if he hadn't heard it. Only after he told her enough about his plans, his information, his needs, only then did she let him see the hunger in her eyes. She wanted that ship. Eventually, he would end up as her new captain, though. For what he later swore was the last time in his life, he was wrong. He was with her as she ambushed Captain's fancy, crippled the merchanter, forced the vessel to surrender, and Nick wanted them humiliated, of course, but he was a bit young to stomach such frank slaughter. After killing the crew, emptying the holds, gutting the communications gear, she laughed at Nick and scarred him and abandoned him. So absolutely humiliated. I don't want to say that what happened to him is even close to what's happening to Morn. But, each one of these characters, as I mentioned, they all have their trauma. They all have their reasoning to do what they're doing. But after that, he was alone on a wreck 1,000,000 kilometers from the station. By rights, he should have died. He didn't, though. Instead, he became the Nick Scorso he was now. He'd assumed the ID files and certifications of the ship's cabin boy, the real Nick Scorso. Which makes me wonder, are we ever going to learn his real name? I hope so. Once rescued, of course, he'd given the UMCP everything he knew about the woman who cut him. He never saw her again. So, again, another thing I wonder, will we ever meet her again? He wouldn't have lifted a finger to help Morn Highland. Women in pain were the next best thing to women who loved him. So there's this great, again, like I said, we're living this fiction, these events through just demeanor, right? How we perceive reality to be, but we don't see behind the eyes. We get a glimpse because Donaldson is taking us there, but it's cool to see that how, not everything really is what it seems to be. But under these circumstances, Nick Sicurso was drawn to the idea of rescuing Morn for several reasons. Angus Thermopylae himself was one of them. He was a dangerous competitor. Did he see her as a source of wealth? Did he mean to exact ransom for the Highland family from Combine Station, the UMCP itself? So Angus Thermopylae was wrong about Nick. He needed money, therefore he needed Mallory's. Needed the people who came to Mallory's and sold secrets. Gruffly he ordered Morn to a seat at one of the condensation-stained tables, a seat with her back to Nick Sicurso, because he can't stand it when she's looking at him, because, again, he thinks that he has more control, even though Angus has the little device. But that is not the case at all. They all want each other, kind of, for certain reasons. But look at us, you bastards, you motherfucking sons of shit. Look at her. She's mine. He was going to have to kill Nick. There was no other answer. There was no other way to hurt her enough to punish her for doing this to him. Through sheer force of panic, he stayed in Mallory's for more than an hour. Then he took Morn back to Bright Beauty. After that, he engaged her zone implant control, under control again. And he pushed the buttons which put her to sleep. Then he scooped her up in his arms and carried her to birth. Then he started to howl like a grief-stricken beast. So poor little Angus, he shows up. He sees Nick. He sees Nick's reaction to Morn. He sees Morn's reaction to Nick, and he is reminded once again he has no control. The only control he has is with this zone implant. So poor guy. Not really though, right? Which brings us to chapter 12. He would have been better off if he had gone to a bootleg shipyard, of course. Perhaps he could have sold Morn's favors for the money he needed to get Bright Beauty made whole. So he's really upset here. He would have been better off if he'd simply undocked from Combine Station, launched a few torpedoes at Captain's Fancy, and then fled for his life. He would have been better off if he killed Morn Highland and ashed her in Bright Beauty's thruster tubes. Instead, he worked on arranging Nick's destruction. First, of course, he took care of Bright Beauty. He had her serviced as thoroughly as possible, and he gave her name and ID letters a fresh coat of paint. I love that touch because it's it's purely cosmetic, which is interesting because clearly he is not a cosmetic man. He's a very ugly man. He doesn't take care of himself. But you know how Morn's beauty kind of made him sick, but he can't resist it. And I don't know. I think there's some interesting subtext to the fact that he actually gives the name on his ship a fresh coat of paint. But breaking into the station's main computer, he pulled as much data as he could. So he is doing some hacking right now. And he put Morn to sleep so that she wouldn't know about and couldn't interfere with what he did. He went EVA, so he went in this EVA suit. He got away with it because it was such an odd thing to do. Nobody noticed what Angus was doing. He moved along the staggering curve of Combine skin from Bright Beauty to Captain's Fancy. He used a current sensor to read each of the lines connecting the ship to the station until he identified the one that carried the data stream and ran the dummy back to his ship. His computer had the codes and routing. Now it had an echo of the actual data stream. Soon he could call up a display of everything Captain's Fancy and Combine Station said to each other. Under different circumstances, he would have used what he knew to plunder Nick's finances. Now, however, Angus had other plans. He programmed his computer to alert him if any one of a long list of key words and names appeared in the ship station dialogue. Then he left Bright Beauty and went about the business of behaving normally. I don't know, is normal really in his vocabulary? And Nick had received 2 messages in a code Angus's computer didn't recognize and couldn't crack, but he could trace them. They came from station security. There was in fact a leak in security, a traitor. He had an ally in security, a friend in power. Who could that person be? That made him more dangerous, so it's complicating the relationship here. But it also diminished him. He didn't stand on his own. You bastard. Angus muttered through his teeth. You shit-eating bastard. I'm going to rip your balls off. Some of the dialogue, it makes me laugh in here. What's crazy about this book is it goes to some very dark places, but sometimes the dialogue, it's just kind of like that old sci-fi, the old gritty sci-fi. But it was just a question of when and where. You better watch out, Nick. Which brings us to chapter 13. During this period, nearly a week, Moore and Hyland spent most of her time either catatonic or asleep. When Angus wanted to use her, he did so without rousing her from the influence of her zone implant. Man, he just, he keeps going. He got her out of bed only for meals or to go to Mallory's with him. But the second week was different. Now Angus timed his trips away from Bright Beauty to coincide with Nick's absences from Captain's Fancy, and he wore under his ship suit a nerve beeper. Taking Morn with him now to Mallory's was part of Angus's plan, part of the bait. He wanted to make Nick want her badly enough to take action. He wanted Nick to do something because almost anything he did would give Angus an excuse to kill him, and would provide as well a plea of self-defense against any murder charge. So he made sure Nick saw Morn as often as possible. He flaunted her in front of Nick, urging him, goading him. Each time he put her where she and Nick could see each other, he swore to himself, promised that as soon as he got her back to the ship, he was going to rip out her female organs and feed them down the garbage processor so that no man would ever have any reason to desire her again. Wow. He's really hurt deeply in this case, or in this sense. But in each time when he returned to Bright Beauty, he couldn't control the gentleness which came over him. He flung obscenities at her with his mouth, but his touch was soft, nearly tentative. So, I don't know, man. I don't know how I feel about Angus. Like, he does some really terrible stuff, but he just can't, I don't know. He's interesting, as dark as he is. Alone in the command module, he had to grind his teeth to keep from howling. Damn you completely to hell and whore. What have you done to me? He told himself he was ready, but the clenched ache deep down in his gut told him he wasn't ready. He'd waited and plotted and struggled for a week, and still, Nick did nothing. With Morn, he spent an inordinately long time in Mallory's, seething under Nick's gaze and ignoring it. He contrived to arrive in the doorway in time to block Nick's way. After you, Captain Scorso, he growled. I know you're in a hurry. On the contrary, Captain Thermopyle, I'm in no hurry at all. Please, after you. Thermopylae. Get it right, Scorso. You're plotting, Captain Thermopyle. You're hatching something. You've got it in your pocket right now. Or are you just playing with yourself? Oh, Nick. Nick and his retinue, 3 men, 2 women, were unarmed. So this is a cool little showdown we got here. We got like a little bit of a fight, finally. He let Nick see him swallow, hesitate. Then he said, let's talk about it outside. After you. No, I insist. I'm after you. Ooh, with the emphasis on you. I think I know. I think you guys know what the subtext is there. The hell you are. You don't care about me. You're after her. And in his pocket, one of the fingers tapped Morn's zone implant control, sending a spasm through her muscles. As a result, she blocked the exit behind Nick, as if she were on Angus's side and wanted to fight for him. Wow, controlling her like a robot in that regard. At the same time, Angus pivoted on Nick, grabbed him by the ship suit, and slung him like a duffel bag around and against the wall. He struck Nick across the side of his head. The blow made Nick crumple. Nick's retinue burst out of Mallory, knocking Morn to the deck. Angus faced them as if he were calm. His fingers were wrapped around their captive's neck. Go fucking back inside. I'm not fucking done with him. Then the 2 women jerked Morn up from her deck and clamped her hands around her windpipe. Oh man, we're at a standstill right now. Stand off, a man said. You kill him, we kill her. You kill her, I kill him. Put her fucking down. And they let go of Morn and backed away. Angus's nerve beeper tingled, warning him that Captain's Fancy had sent out a call for Nick Scorso, and he opened his fist and let Nick fall, though. He keyed the commands on the zone implant control, which brought Morn back to her feet. The way her gaze sprang involuntarily to Nick's sprawled form hurt him worse than anything Nick could have done in a fight. I really like that line, because even though Angus is winning right now, technically, he is losing. Angus returned Morn to Bright Beauty and sealed the hatches. This time he was determined to do her serious harm because of what she did. He meant to damage her, needed to damage her. She deserved it. But first he checked the computer monitoring Captain's Fancy station communications. Security and immediately requested Nick Scorso's return to his ship. His instincts were shouting at him. Go at once, escape before Nick could take revenge. But there was no way to leave. He knew it when Nick got aboard. After that, for some reason, Captain's Fancy cleared all channels and stopped talking to station. Get ready. I think we're going somewhere. What was Nick doing? Getting ready, of course. Getting ready to leave. But why? Because security had told him something. What? Angus sucked his upper lip. What had security told Nick Scorso? Indecision paralyzed him. He didn't know how to go against his instincts. Bright Beauty's communication systems cracked awake. Immediately, his speakers broadcast the call. The incoming supply ship from Earth cried for help. Navigational computer wrecked. Somebody on the crew crazy with gap sickness. Coordinates lost. Control lost. Crisis urgent. Triangulate and pursue. Distress, distress, distress. Incoming supply ship. And it was weeks early. That was what security was talking to Nick Scorso about. The ship wouldn't be expecting his attack. Angus's receivers picked up a burst of static. The orders blared in his ears. Bright Beauty, this is Station Center. You must redock. An emergency has been declared. Emergency procedures are in force. You may not depart. If you ignore this instruction, you will be fired upon. Captain's Fancy must have received the same orders because Nick ignored them. She waited for the first warning shots to be fired. Then she winked off Angus's screens, disappeared as completely as if she'd ceased to exist. Bright Beauty was already in her escaped attitude. The shit-eaters in center had that one chance to kill him, but they missed it. They started transmitting his own distress call. There's a short somewhere. Smoke. Controls locked. I can't navigate. Don't shoot. I'm trying to come around. And that froze center gave him enough time. Brace yourself. This is going to hurt. And he engaged Bright Beauty's power boosters, and after that, Calm Mind's guns couldn't track him. Angus and Morin were unconscious, of course. The stress was too much to sustain. So that's a really cool image where he's just blasting off with these thrusters, and he's like in his G seat, and they pass out because it's just too much. Angus recovered first. He stayed where he was, however, breathing deeply and trying to clear his head. A short time later, Morin twitched, groaned, lifted her head. She put her hands on her console and started tapping in instructions. He glanced over at her and saw the look of rapture on her face. That look was unmistakable. The whole inside of my head was different. I was floating, and everything was clear. It was like the universe spoke to me. Uh-oh. She was trying to feed a self-destruct sequence into Bright Beauty's engines. He activated the zone implant control. Morin's hands fell off the console, and she slumped in her G-seat. So we were almost coming, again, full circle, right? Without gap capability, Bright Beauty lacked Captain's Fancy ability to leave Calm Mind and the belt for some other star system or station, but Angus couldn't risk an attack on the supply ship. No, Angus was after Nick himself. What he wanted was to catch Nick gutting the lost ship. He could rescue the crew if Nick had left any of them alive, keep as much of the cargo as he wanted for himself, salvage the rest, go back to Calm Mind like a hero. His instincts assured him this was the wrong thing to do. He ignored them. There's a lot of that too, where it's very comic book, where we talk about his instincts and it's like, nope, but he does something else. He returned to his G seat and began testing all the sensors and sifters and sniffers to make sure they were in proper tune. Whenever he chewed his upper lip, though, he tasted blood again. Well, that brings us to the end. That was a cool little romp, I guess. We can see that Angus's problems, his his self-conscious nature, are hitting him really hard when Nick comes back into the picture, or into the picture, I guess, because we've kind of already been here before. And we learn why Morin is with him. Now we know that. We also learn why Morin is looking at Nick and why Nick is looking at Morin, and is for none of the reasons that any observer would assume. So good stuff. Still loving the story. There's only one video left in this series because we're going to wrap this book up entirely in the next one. Let me know how you're feeling about it. Are you still with me? I know some of you out there are still with me and are ready to see Angus and Morin's and Nick's dramatic conclusion. Well, I guess it's not a conclusion because this is a 5-book series, a very long 5-book series, and that the page count just compounds over time with every volume. But I'm looking forward to exploring this world and these characters further after this one. This was enough to whet my appetite. Hopefully it was enough to whet yours. The books are relatively cheap. They came out in the 90s, so you're not going to have to pay too much for them, and I'm sure you could find them easily used somewhere if you don't want to even pay for them new. But thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next video with the very final video, the final episode of Stephen R. Donaldson's The Real Story. Thanks. Bye.